Okay, so hello, thank you for coming. And just before I start, I wanted to thank Alu for hosting this today, and for everyone at Aksioma for facilitating the talk and my new exhibition at their gallery. It's, like as someone who's kind of maybe followed the Aksioma program from afar for the last number of years, like it really is a pleasure and an honor to be here in Ljubljana today. So I've had this like shtick for that I've been doing for years every time I'm asked to talk about my practice, and it goes something like, it's the year 2013. I've just started lecturing at an art school in Ireland, and it's on a degree course called Photography and Lens-Based Media. And in 2013, like the internet had already changed the photographic medium quite a lot, not as profoundly as it has today. But I was beginning to wonder why the hell any 20-year-old would want to study photography in this day and age at that particular time. And then, beginning to answer that, this new subject began to appear, and the new subject maybe asked this question about what happened to photograph after it was taken. So the lens aspect of the of photographic production was becoming more of this like technical stage within this wider procedure of disseminating images on some sort of network, right? So making photographs was part of this process of inhabiting and producing space across distances and time frames, and it was doing so in a way that like printed photography had never really done. They never really achieved it before. But as we all know, this kind of idea goes far beyond like photographic media. That all media has had these kind of real world material effects in our daily lives. And I've often thought it's like it essentially just comes down to code and software and how this produces these new spaces in which we live. And I think, unless like your name is Jean Baudrillard, who is kind of, dead for 10 years at this point already, in 2016, you probably thought about reality and the internet were two separate entities. But, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, it kind of like proven that this like fissure in the fabric of the network had opened up, and, the internet was pouring out into reality, and reality was beginning to merge with like a digital representation of itself. And even there was hints of it beforehand, so in 2014, you had this thing, Gamergate, which was this kind of deranged outbursts of incel rage in relation to video games. And it was where like we were really beginning to see how digital spaces were being politicized, and how therefore they're going to really like, like have these like real world effects in the years to come, And I think we could like even make an argument now that like you can trace a line from the Gamergate thing in 2014 to the re-election of Donald Trump in 2024. And I think during like that decade, like there was just so many conversations in the media and in, even like in culture in the art world, that in some way, like we're all kind of trying to observe or describe these material effects of the digital in what we used to call the real world, And it begins to ask maybe like, how do networks and digital cultures affect the spaces that we inhabit? And if these so-called virtual spaces have material effects, then, like, should we treat them accordingly? And the first project of mine that really kind of began to explore this relationship between physical and digital space in this way took place here. Now, some of you may recognize this. This is the city of Los Santos, which is the fictional city that sets the stage for the video game Grand Theft Auto 5. And so for those of you who are not familiar, Grand Theft Auto is this open world game. And an open world game just means that the players aren't fixed to a narrative. You can opt to go anywhere and do anything. And it was one day in the game, I'd noticed something which hadn't previously registered with me. There was this area of the city called Strawberry here, where it was like under a bridge, there was this community of homeless men and women. And I instantly parked the car and I got out and I approached the characters on foot. And like, it was kind of strange the first time, like the hair stood up on the back of my neck as I was kind of just observing this kind of spooky variety of simulated men and women in some sort of social gathering. And I remember that every player in the game has a virtual smartphone in their pocket, which, you can take out and you can do all sorts of smartphone things, like in our world. But what excited me most was that there was this little camera app on the phone that serves to, like, as a function to record places in the game with their geolocation. And so here I am playing as a drug addict in the game, and I'm taking out my camera and I'm making some snapshots of the architecture around me. So this operates basically in the same way real cameras do, that you're walking around a three-dimensional space, you find a subject, you point a camera, you can pose the shot, you might even focus the lens, and you click the shutter and you've taken a photograph. But once the photographs are taken, they're uploaded to this virtual social networking site that exists to kind of bridge our world and the game world, right? And at about 700 pixels width, these images are not meant for much more than looking at on a screen. But I was kind of thinking about the low resolution is less of a problem, and it's more just a material condition of the contemporary digital photograph. And JPEG artifacts on the surface of these images, I kind of began to see them as a scar that began to signify how images move through the network in a particular way because of capitalism, i.e. that smaller files require less bandwidth and cost less to transfer and to store. And I unwittingly started the role of kind of performing as a documentary photographer. So I kind of sought out where these kind of homeless NPCs were, and I photographed their bodies and their hands and their clothes and their faces and their surroundings. And I drove around just to try and find all of the symptoms of poverty. And it became this series called Down and Out in Los Santos. So this series was initially a way of asking, can a virtual body perform the role of a street photographer in a meaningful way? I think in doing so, it became clear to me that the homeless people and their surroundings are kind of symptomatic of a wealth disparity in the game. And I think this is where the kind of primary tragedy of all of this stuff becomes really apparent, because in order for this simulation to be sufficiently immersive and realistic, the inclusion of poverty has to be this ubiquitous feature in the game, And so if we think about that, in order for the game developers to achieve realism, it must include the real. And so I'd claim that even though these images or photographs are produced within a corporate video game simulation, that this is contemporary reality, because it wouldn't be in the game if society wasn't like this, of course, right? And so in a way, it's like with hindsight, I just felt that this is a natural evolution of the practice of screenshotting, so capturing what's on our devices. And, and that's an evolution in kind of not only relation to the technical evolution of the in-game photography, that it was being bound to a virtual body rather than, just taking a screen capture, but also that this digital space and its relationship to what we called reality, and rather than the subject of this series being about capitalism or poverty, I was thinking that maybe that's more the object of this series. I felt like this series was beginning to open up a pathway for me to explore how physical and digital spaces were actually being produced, where do these things converge, and how do we get here? So Down and Out in Los Santos as just a kind of a project I was working on really kind of made me curious about all sorts of questions. But the primary idea would be what would an art object look like if it began to straddle these digital spaces, physical material, but then also importantly like cultural and historical narratives, so like the symbolic realm that these things live in as well. And one of the first stops on my journey to begin to answer this was yet another really weird and strange place called the United Kingdom, and in particular the work of Anna Atkins from the 19th century. And Atkins is an incredibly important pioneer in a photographic process called the cyanotype. I'm sure many of you here are aware of it, but for those who are not familiar, here's some stills from YouTube. So the process involves coating a paper with a chemical solution, which once dry, the paper becomes photosensitive, and through a contact exposure where you're pressing objects or contact negatives onto the paper's surface, the chemicals react with sunlight, and after an amount of time, we wash away the remaining chemicals which have been activated by UV light. We wash away in a bath of water, and this leaves a photographic imprint of the contact exposure for the rest of eternity, basically. And the process involves no ink, so it's a purely chemical and photographic process. So Anna Atkins in the 19th century was kind of incredible because like she was working as a botanist, and this was a shortcut in labor as opposed to doing illustrations. And she made this cyanotype process most famous through documenting the algae of the British Isles. And significantly, it was just out of interest, I think it's worth noting that she was producing these works just 3 years after photography was invented. So this is like probably a really weird thing to be doing with your time in one sort of way. It was quite a new, novel approach. In fact, this other weird thing that was happening at the time was that there was somebody who was interviewing me a few years ago was telling me that Anna Atkins had made the cyanotype process so popular with Victorian era housewives of the middle class that a couple of species of algae went extinct from people over cyanotyping them. So it's kind of like this really weird like example of like photographic superabundance, or photography having these kind of ecological effects in the same way we could think about like TikTok and Instagram's data centers boiling the oceans. So I think the extinction anecdote is kind of apt as well with these, because the project I began to work on here was to document kind of infinitely reproducible but lifeless plants, right? So the photochemical qualities that I really love of this media kind of led me to produce a series of work that aims to embody a sort of like limbo space somewhere between a corporate virtual reality simulation and the physical material world as well. And so I started going on a series of meta nature walks, essentially. And what you see here is like produced by extracting a JPEG texture file to make up the video game Plant Life, and making these contact exposures through real sunlight in order to produce these kind of image objects. And the works, like, they're not so much an academic survey, but they are kind of virtual reality botany collection. So as a homage to Anna Atkins, I've kind of kept the formal qualities of her project the same in mind. So you'll have like the image with the file name, just as in hers you had the image and the scientific categorization. And it involves like trawling through like literally millions of the files in the game's database to find the plant or grass images that are used in the game that make up the ambient nature in the video games that we play. And having hacked out these images, I resize them to an approximate real world scale. And I labeled them according to their names in the database where appropriate. And I print them onto large transparencies, which are going to be used for contact exposures. And alongside that process, I'm also preparing the photosensitive cyanotype paper by hand in the same process that Anna Atkins did in the 19th century. And when just one exposure of each virtual plant is made, I destroy the transparency film. So these are kind of, teleported from being digital files that are can be cloned infinitely every time the game loads to these entirely unique physical objects. And what makes these quite different from their source material is that the handmade and the chemical process has this kind of chaotic artifacts on the surface of the final object. And I feel like it kind of transforms the subject so that the surface of the image is physical material rather than just being ones and zeros in a file somewhere. So like for me, these aren't to be thought of as 2D images, that I think of them more closer to sculpture, that they are physical objects and they're made out of paper, which is also dead plants, to think about it in that way. And, thinking about their physicality, like, is an appropriate thing in terms of the source material as well, because, and I think this relationship between the image and the materials led me to this next project, which is called 100 Years of Solitude, which is named after the Gabriela Garcia Marquez book, which is a story which spans generations of this fictional family and their repetitive failures in a fictional town called Macondo. And the book is essentially like a metaphor. It's meant to represent like the Central American journey into modernism from the 19th to the 20th century, as the kind of battles from, colonial kind of modernity begin to conflict with the lives of the people in Macondo. But once again, I started to think about how I got here. I was thinking about early photography, but this time I was thinking about wet plate collodion photography, which is maybe a little less well known than the cyanotype process. But again, it's from the mid-19th century, and it was arguably the first photographic medium that was used to seriously develop a language for landscape photography. This is the first kind of camera that they were bringing around to produce like kind of epic landscape pictures. And one of the first notable practitioners in America was this guy called Carlton Watkins. And, again, he was working for science, so he was like going around with geologists and he was documenting Yosemite National Park in California, right? So wet plate collodion process involves making an exposure onto glass or tin using a photosensitive silver nitrate solution, and you're developing the image while the chemicals are still wet on the plate, so it's a real time-sensitive process to pull off. But Watkins' work at Yosemite, when I was kind of researching this years ago, it really made me think a lot about how landscape photography hasn't really changed as well, in fact, even Yosemite as a subject, still appears today. We see it in films, we see it in YouTube memes, like double rainbow all the way across the sky, Apple desktop wallpapers, we see it in video games, and the views are remarkably the same, I think that's kind of just flipped around the wrong way in whatever way he printed his collodion here, but that's essentially an Apple desktop wallpaper taken in the 1870s. Now, this kind of got me into this idea about the 19th century American landscape as this site of repetition and cultural echoes, and I'm really into things that repeat a lot, right? So I was kind of interested that creators and artists still can't get away from this. And my series, 100 Years of Solitude, actually follows this really simple process. So I'm using this 19th century photographic tool to document landscapes from video games that are set in the 19th century. And the first game of this type that was going to appear and represent the American West was called Boot Hill. And this game is from 1974. And I love the idea that, roughly 100 years after the wet plate collodion process was being used and the first landscape photography was flourishing in the American West, that this new medium was born. And it was called the video game. And one of the first things they did was try and replicate these 19th century landscapes. So cultures kind of loved this repetition long before we had copy-paste. And the series documents around 50 years of the evolution of video game resolution. But, it's not just resolution, it's not just more pixels. What we're witnessing is the kind of, is the evolution and the production of space and simulations. So the series records how spatial simulation technologies were evolving, and so they're always like this attempt to render a realist false memory. And there's more than 30 works in this series from, various platforms over 4 or 5 decades, and they all use the traditional wet plate collodion process using the photosensitive silver chemicals, and I do them on black glass rather than transparent glass or tin. And I was kind of thinking like the process had just led naturally from the virtual plants in the last project I was talking about, where they're like rendered as photographic objects onto plant-based material, onto paper. There's a similar thing going on here, but instead we have these landscape photographs of places that don't really exist, but they're rendered as physical objects onto black glass and silver nitrate. And these are two substances that require really heavy extractive processes to synthesize these. So we're cutting holes out of the earth to produce these. So when we look at these objects, the only thing that's of this earth itself, when we look at this, is the medium itself. And the image that appears on the substrate is kind of just a collective hallucination in a way. So at this point of my research, I was really kind of getting into the physicality of content, we could say. But I was thinking as well, it's going to be important to kind of get to grips with code as well when we do these projects. So this project is, I guess, materializing a digital object in a way more extreme way. So this is a public artwork that was commissioned by Dublin City in 2021. And it's now located in a place called Smithfield. And the sculpture is 2 tons of bronze, and it spans almost 5 meters from handle to spout. So it's kind of a large object, but it's a physical interpretation of the Utah teapot. So what's the Utah teapot? The Utah teapot is one of the first 3D digital objects ever. So it was made available by mathematician Martin Newell at the University of Utah in 1975. It's a digital teapot, but it's still known and widely used today in 3D visualization software. So it still comes with most 3D design apps as a primitive shape. So a primitive is in a cube, a cone, a sphere, a pyramid, a teapot. And the Utah teapot is quite well known to mathematicians, software engineers, architects, 3D animators and artists, and it's quite frequently an in-joke, but it is also a very useful object working in the medium. And I proposed this work specifically for this location, as it's a short walk from multiple art schools, dozens of architectural practices, there's loads of computer science courses, there's this really good art house cinema on the square, and there's also an Oscar-winning animation studio there. And so, having significantly been redeveloped in the last 20 years, this area that we're looking at here, called Smithfield, all of the buildings, the plaza, the benches, the trash cans, the lampposts, and even that tram that's going through in the video there, they've all been designed using some sort of 3D CAD software that exists today because of the developments that were enabled by the Utah teapot since 1975. So my proposal to locate the Utah teapot here was kind of arguing that the production of Smithfield was both a technological and cultural one. It was part of this global story that was happening. And the evolution of the software for image production technologies, these things are really tied to the spatial production pipeline in the 21st century. And I felt like the act of materializing this icon, producing a literal monument to 3D graphics, was this way of acknowledging the role of software in the production of space. So how the production of space is not merely an act of visualizing drawings, but relies on an evolving cultural and mimetic narratives being spun out. So it's important here that the work itself evolves too, and beyond like Irish lads drawing dicks on it, the teapot is in a public space, and that gets sucked back into the network, and in turn it produces these new forms. What you saw there was essentially the Google Street View version of the teapot, which is stitched together by their photo algorithms. And I thought it was really funny that there's like a 3D test object, which, the point of the Utah teapot is to test your software's ability to represent objects on the screen. And, Google Earth produces this like really dog shit version of the whole thing, So I decided I was going to produce this kind of singular object based on that. So this is a work in progress where I'm now making a physical version of the Google Earth version of the Smithfield, Utah, blah, blah, blah. It's too silly to kind of describe properly, but it's just been cast in bronze in Dublin, and it's going to be finished in a way that brings together the two extremities of the bronze material. So on one level, you're going to have this like heavily green oxidation patina, but also there's going to be this like strip of highly polished polygons along the facade as well. And, so again, like while we're materializing digital artifacts, I just thought it'd be nice to maybe attempt to, make something that's kind of beautiful as well, that people might want to live with. And, like it's even if it is based on, something that's, digital trash. Speaking of which, I have a new show called The Production of Space at Aksioma. And I've been working on this project for, I guess, like the past 3 years or so. Production of Space is a project that actually reinterprets an image asset file that came with 3D animation and modeling software in the early 90s. And the project was actually initially inspired by this GitHub page that I came across once by a collective of media archaeologists called Render 96. And Render 96 are interested in pulling apart the construction of video games and all of the kind of video game worlds from the 90s. And I think in particular, they really get into the Nintendo 64 console. So this group, Render 96, set out to ask why all these games from major studios like Nintendo and Naughty Dog and Sony all feature the same brick patterns on the wall, right? So collectively they gather about like 20 examples of games that spanned like well over a decade, where they kept seeing these like the same brick and cobblestone textures appear, So they're claiming that some texture began to homogenize the medium and therefore the spatial experience, and therefore this is why we get all nostalgic when we think of these cobblestone brick worlds that we used to play video games in the 90s, if you're old enough. So I do have to say, like, I think some of their findings are a bit like less than convincing, and some of their evidence is a little doctored, but I feel like collectively they wrote this history of video game space that even if it is a little fantastical, it itself has produced a new way of looking at the medium, because there's all these like multiple articles and YouTube shorts over the years have been produced about their discovery. And so kind of, even if it's not 100% true, becomes part of canon. But the significant discovery under GitHub was that there was a set of brick and cobblestone image assets that came free with a 3D modeling software app in the 1993, and it was called Alias 3. If any of you use something called Maya, that's what the software was in 1993. And the brick images were ended up being used by multiple major software developers for well over a decade, and they produced the spatial architecture and the aesthetic of games such as like Mario Kart, Donkey Kong, Mortal Kombat, Final Fantasy VII, Star Fox Adventures, Banjo-Kazooie, if you go back to like the aftermath, like we're kind of suffering this aftermath of Gamergate that happened in the last decade. So if we think about like how video game space has become this captured political space, there's this symbolic dimension which has been hijacked in order to change the material world in which we live. And I think about how the technical like assembly and production of video game worlds as digital objects and logistical process is only part of how we need to read these spaces. And I became sort of interested in the image asset, an image asset being, that coming with a piece of software was going to have these transformative effects and cultural homogenization and produce this kind of, nostalgia in the symbolic realm. And it made me think of this old geezer here, right? So my project, The Production of Space, takes its name and its kind of modality of thinking from this French philosopher and sociologist called Henri Lefebvre. So I took the title essentially from his book from 1974, which is, within 1 year of the Utah Teapot first appearing. But his book was called The Production of Space. Now, this book has been like profoundly impactful on architecture, town planning fields, Marxist praxis, and especially like since I think it only got translated into English in the 90s and became very influential in the Anglosphere in architecture worlds. And, listen, I'm not going to be able to do this like true justice intellectually because I went to art school twice, but like just in order to outline what this book is about, he's basically arguing that we have to think about space beyond geometry, right? So against history since Descartes, where space is understood as like mathematics and geometry, Lefebvre is kind of challenging this view, saying that space has these social, political, and economic dimensions as well. So if we think about how space is social, space is like not just this empty backdrop, space in how we use it and what it means to humans. Space isn't a neutral area where things just happen. It's produced and shaped by social actions and power structures, right? And it does this through codes and symbols as well. But space is not like purely a code or diagram to be deciphered. Seeing space as a series of signs actually reduces its complexity. Since space isn't something to be read, it's something we're supposed to live through. So, and because it's in flux, then like space becomes this tool for power and control. So people who are in power, if you think about governments or businesses or software developers, they can shape space in order to maintain control. And it's kind of like obvious stuff when you think about it, but it's kind of putting like some sort of theory structure around these ideas. He finally kind of thinks about also like the illusion of transparency in space, where like so many people just assume that space is neutral, that it just exists, and there was some space there, so we put a building there, rather than all the things that have to happen. So he's saying that space is kind of full of these like hidden secrets and meanings, and like the transparency of space is just an illusion, that power structures are constantly manipulating space that are in ways that aren't always obvious. And in his idea, he actually illustrates this thought process for the social production of space as a triad. So he had a number of triads, but the social production of space, I'll talk about quickly here as a little cheat sheet. So these forces are always going to be in flux. They're not like static things. So as one part, we're going to talk about perceived space, which is spatial practice, conceived space, which is representations of space, and lived space, which is representational space. Now, this isn't supposed to be a grammar lesson, but we're going to get into what this means. So perceived space is basically the physical space that you use every day. So people move through it, and we can think about it as the way commuters walk through a subway station. But conceived space is space as it's designed, space that's created by those in power, i.e. architects, planners, governments. So we can think about the example there as a city's master plan with zones for housing, business and industry. And then we have live space, which is representational space. So the space that is emotionally and symbolically experienced. So the symbolic realm. And the example here is like, a park where a family gathers every weekend, and it makes it special to them. That's not something that that is visible, like perceived space, and it's not something that is designed, that meaning isn't designed by those in power. So here's another way we could look at it, right? So the conceived space in the middle there, we say that like Nintendo and Sony design a world using Alias software or Maya or Blender or a game engine. And, there's limitations of gameplay that's imposed by the designed architecture of the game space. And the perceived space, who shapes it? Well, gamers do, and they do that by, playing the levels of the game in the sequence. And then the live space, the representational space, would be shaped by gamers and game fanatics, right? So understanding 90s games, not just as a set of games with a sequence and level, but they're these emotional places defined by let's say, the shared cobble and brick textures, and the cultural style that compounds and creates these social memories. Here's another one. So the conceived space in the middle there, we kind of think about like streaming devices, right? So Twitch TV allows gamers to share their playing experiences in a community, and that allows you broadcast Banjo-Kazooie with an audience who can respond in the chat. So that's the design of Twitch TV. But who shapes it? Well, it's kind of happening somewhere else as well. So you have like undersea cables, data centers, PCs, broadband infrastructure, and that allows you like do a Banjo-Kazooie speed run. But then in the live space, so back in the symbolic realm, is what happens on the stream. So these cultural and experiential things happen, and we get connection, we get memes, we get culture, we get legends, that kind of thing. And so since the people who made this GitHub page were kind of really into this one specific game texture called Cobblestone, like they put that on a pedestal when it was actually the full library of brick textures from Alias 3 that were used across all of these games. And I thought it kind of created this new kind of icon for that, so they were kind of conceiving a new space in a way that I was going to play with here. And I thought it would be nice to produce maybe a small series of monuments to that dimension of video game infrastructure. And so using 3D software like as a production pipeline with traditional fabrication materials, I set out to produce a number of modalities to reinterpret 2D textures as 3D objects. And the way I decided to do this was to take that cobblestone texture and refabricate it using real-world architectural materials. So this image that we're looking at now is the cobblestone in concrete. This one is in fiberglass. This one is in plaster. This one is in oriented strand board wood. This one is polyurethane expanding foam. That was really fun to make. And this one is in copper. And then also thinking about like where loads of these games came from in the 90s, which is Japan, I thought it'd be nice to include within that definition of what our architectural materials was that we could do it in paper. And this was like set out to do an embossed paper project, which is insanely annoying to photograph. But to do this, I had a machine carve the positive and negative geometry into aluminium. And I had a hydraulic press built. So all of the works are like 1 meter by 1 meter, and the hydraulic press like distributes 170 tons of weight over the 1 meter by 1 meter square of paper. And so the install for the show like uses this kind of logic of game design as well. So all the work is 1 meter by 1 meter. And I chose this actually because like most game engines, the places you build video game worlds, they have users build space using the meter as the default unit, right? And the story of the meter is great. So it was invented by these like French maniacs in the late 19th century. And because they wanted to move away from the feet and the yard and the mile because of the connotations. I think the old story was like the foot was designated foot because it was like the size of like a king, like a certain king's foot was that size, which is like like the size of a wizard's armpit or something, I don't know. But like the metrics of the monarchy weren't really ideologically compatible with like, the French thinking about, global domination and thinking about metrics at a planetary scale. So they actually created the meter by measuring the distance between the North Pole and the equator via Paris and dividing that distance by 10 million, right? Which is insane, right? And of course they got it wrong as well. So the whole thing is deranged, right? And this means that when game developers are designing games, even let's say it's on an alien world, and your game is set in an alien world, you're doing so on the scale of a wonky planet Earth always, right? So the show uses this 1 meter by 1 meter grid system to like bisect the gallery space, right? And this is essentially how games were designed in the 90s. You just have this flat plane, it would be a certain width, and you would apply the image texture to it. So I've applied the embossed paper to the metal frame. And the embossed paper squares are fixed to the wall using these custom magnets that I've made that have the cobblestone at a 1 to 100 scale. So they're like little centimeter cube. So again, like the image asset is becoming a kind of part of like the physical infrastructure of the installation. And the paper is like also... like paper's always changing shape and bending because of heat and humidity. It's expanding and contracting, and the magnets allow the material to kind of undulate without causing many issues. So the show also features a 1 meter by 1 meter video screen, which is running a piece of software, and it's finding random Twitch streamers from around the world that are specifically playing the games that were mentioned in that GitHub page that I was talking about. So there's like around 20, 25 games that it's constantly finding from people all over the world. So people are still playing and streaming all of these 90s video games in every country in the world 24/7. So there's a piece of software just finding these people, and it displays a game stream for 60 seconds before moving to the next one. And as it does this, the software is also calculating how many meters across the surface of the Earth the game stream is traveling before it gets to the gallery in Ljubljana. So, for example, the game streamer could be in Tokyo, it goes to a data center in Frankfurt, and then we receive it here in the gallery in Ljubljana, and that's a total of like 9,564,321 meters. And I have a computer voice that's announcing that, and the spatial kind of data infrastructure dimension during each stream, and that's happening in English and Slovenian. Listen, my time is up, but thanks for listening, and do join us at 8 p.m. tonight down at Aksioma. It's a little space I've conceived, and as I said at the start, like, it really is a pleasure and an honor to be here, so thank you so much.